So you see, with no moon, no wind, and black ice, that iceberg was basically invisible that night. And you know, by the time the lookouts were up here, by the time they saw the iceberg, we were only 2 ship lengths away from the iceberg. Can you imagine that? Here's 1 ship length right here. Here's 2 ship lengths there. It was there when they saw the iceberg. Was there really any chance to avoid the iceberg? No, not at all. But First Officer Murdoch, who was in charge at the time, he tried to turn Titanic to avoid the iceberg, and they almost missed it, but it just barely scraped up against the Titanic. And you know what? The iceberg didn't rip a hole in Titanic like many people thought. You see, the steel, which Titanic was made of, was very brittle, because at that time they didn't understand about making steel very well. And it simply pushed the steel in, and the rivets popped out, and it created these little gaps between the steel plates, and all the water rushed in. Now, at first, we didn't really know what had happened. And as a matter of fact, I was in my quarters just falling asleep, because it was about 11:40 p.m. that night on April 14th, 1912, and I felt a slight vibration. So I jumped out of my bed, and I was still in my slippers and my pajamas, and I ran out to the port side, and I looked out there, and I didn't see anything, because we had struck on the starboard side, you see. So I decided, I'll check the starboard side. So I ran over here, but you know what? The ship was going about 25 miles per hour, and at this time, the iceberg was already way back there. So I didn't see anything, and I barely felt anything, because it felt like barely a bump at all. So I went back to my bed, and I started to go back to sleep. But just a few minutes later, one of the junior officers came in and said, "Officer Light told us, sir, we struck an iceberg." Well, that's all I needed to hear, you see. I immediately pulled some pants over my pajamas, I put my shoes on, I put on a big sweater and overcoat, put my hat on, and I went to the bridge. Now, at first, we really didn't know how much damage there was, you see, because Titanic was such a large ship. She's actually 11 stories high. There's 9 decks altogether, and from here to the top of here is 110 feet. Can you imagine how big that is? And all the way to the top of the funnels here is 175 feet. So it's a very big ship altogether, and I was in my quarters right around here. So I barely felt anything. So we had to investigate. And the captain eventually went down with Mr. Thomas Andrews, who was the designer and builder of the ship. And when Mr. Andrews came back, he didn't tell me this, but he told the captain this and Mr. Ismay. The ship only had about 2 hours before it was going to sink. You see, the captain didn't tell the rest of the officers because he didn't want us to panic. Now, I didn't really know what was going on, so eventually I said, "Sir, shouldn't we on the safe side start loading the lifeboats?" And the captain agreed to that. So we started to uncover the lifeboats, and eventually we started to board them. And you see, the very first lifeboat that I loaded, it wasn't this one here, but this is a picture of what a lifeboat might look like, and you can pass that around. The very first lifeboat that I tried to load from the promenade deck right here. But one of the things that I forgot is that on Titanic, we had recently glassed in with windows the promenade deck because the first-class passengers were complaining of getting sprayed by the ocean, you see. Now what happened was, I didn't realize and remember that you had to use a special key to open those windows, and nobody had the key. So we had to leave that lifeboat there. When we went back up to the boat deck here, and we finally loaded lifeboat number 6. And on that lifeboat were some interesting characters, including the lookout who first spotted the iceberg, Mr. Frederick Fleet, Quartermaster Hitchens, who was the wheelsman who turned the wheel to try to avoid the iceberg, and also a Mrs. Margaret J.J. Brown, although I think you might know her as Mrs. Molly Brown. Have any of you heard of a Molly Brown before? You have? Well, maybe can you explain something for me? My understanding is she either went by the name of Margaret or Maggie, never Molly, you see. Do you know how she got the name of Molly? Anybody? I don't either, it's a mystery. But you see, she was quite a remarkable woman because Quartermaster Hitchens, who was also in the lifeboat, he technically was in charge of the boat. But he was not very brave or very gallant that night. You men would be brave and gallant, wouldn't you? You would save all the women and children, wouldn't you? I'm sure you would. So Quartermaster Hitchens was not like that. So Mrs. Brown basically took control, and she threatened to throw him overboard. He wouldn't keep quiet. So eventually, she encouraged all those fine first-class ladies in that lifeboat to get their hands dirty and actually do some manual labor for once in their lives and row that little lifeboat to safety. And does anybody know the name of the rescue ship that actually picked up the people on Titanic? Do you know the name of the ship? What's the name? Not quite the Lusitania. That's one of the fastest ships afloat, but she wasn't in the area at the time. Do you know, madam? No, not quite. One more guess. The Olympic. No, the Olympic actually did come to the rescue, but she was over 500 miles away. The ship that came to our rescue is this one called the Carpathia, yes. It was from our rival line, the Cunard line. So you can pass around this photograph of the Carpathia. So when Mrs. Brown reached the Carpathia, you know what she did? She spent most of her time comforting the survivors, especially the third-class passengers, as she was fluent in many different languages. And here are some of the survivors on board the Carpathia right there. And you know what? Even after they reached New York City, and all of Mrs. Molly Brown's good first-class friends went off to their fancy hotels, she stayed on board the ship Carpathia until every single survivor had someplace to go or somebody to look after them. And before she left, she even started the very first Titanic survivor fund. Quite a remarkable woman, Mrs. Margaret J.J. Brown, you know. And you know what? She almost didn't get into the lifeboat at all. I had to talk her into getting on board. Well, you know, in the early parts of the sinking, as I said, I didn't really believe the ship was going down, and most of the passengers didn't believe it either. Well, this was the Titanic, after all. She was supposed to be unsinkable. So the women and children refused to get into the lifeboats. On many occasions, we physically had to pick them up and try to lower them into the boats. Until finally Captain Smith said, just lower the boats with who you can, and we'll have the crew members row towards the ship we can see on the horizon. Well, if you didn't know this, there was a ship that was so close to Titanic as she was sinking,